Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Million Coaches Challenge webinar. My name is Haviland Rummel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Susan Crown Exchange. I'm joined today by leaders in the field and people that we at SCE are proud to call our partners. Before I introduce them, I want to give a quick background on the Million Coaches Challenge. At SCE, we are interested in preparing the rising generations to thrive in a rapidly changing world. One way we approach this is by helping young people develop crucial skills, social and emotional skills, that better help equip youth for life success. We have been working in the SEL arena for 7 years, partnering with academics and practitioners, community-based organizations, and national serving networks like the YUSA and After School All-Stars. Over the past 2 years, we've become particularly interested in the roles youth sports, and specifically coaches, can play in helping youth develop social and emotional skills. What we learned is that less than 1/3 of the country's 6 million coaches have been trained in youth development practices. We believe this is a missed opportunity. The Million Coaches Challenge was launched to help close that gap. Through investing in SEL and youth development training across the US, we are aiming to train 1 million coaches by 2025. In a few minutes, you'll hear more about the current state of coach training and the increasing need for a well-trained coach, as well as how you can participate in the Million Coaches Challenge. But before we get started, we'd like to learn a little bit more about who is joining us today. Please take a moment to respond to this poll. Great. So it looks like we have a wide range of folks joining us today, from coaches themselves to youth sports providers, leaders, parents, and other. I'm curious to hear who that is. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. We want you to participate in this conversation, and you can do so by 3 different ways. The first is through our chat function. Click the icon at the bottom of the screen to share your thoughts. Will McEnany from the SE team will be hosting that part of the conversation and post related links for resources throughout the conversation. The second way is through the Q&A section. So again, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please share your question through that icon for our panelists. And finally, we encourage you to participate in the polls throughout the webinar. We're going to kick things off with a brief video on the Million Coaches Challenge.
My coach is strong.
My coach is a mentor.
My coach is a teacher.
My coach is a believer.
She is my superhero.
Big sister.
Morale booster.
Life changer.
Inspiration. Confidence builder.
Motivational.
My coach is my idol.
My coach is my role model.
She's became like a mom to me. She calls herself my mom.
He's not just a coach. He's like another dad of mine.
I'm pleased to introduce Tom and Chris, who will share a bit more about the status of youth sports participation and coach training and the value of comprehensive training that includes youth development. Joining us is Tom Ferry, who's the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Project Play, and Chris Moore, the CEO of Positive Coaching Alliance. Thank you, Tom and Chris.
Well, thank you, Haviland. Really great to be a partner with you on this incredibly important project. We within Project Play have recognized the role of coaches, the essential role of coaches in improving the quality of the experience, helping kids be active through life, and just growing and developing in all the ways that we want kids to develop through sports. They're essential agents, and really appreciate your very sincere and very deep commitment to changing the culture of youth sports in this country. So I want to give you start off with a little bit of data here, and then I'm going to have a conversation with Chris Moore, the CEO of the Positive Coaching Alliance, about the role of coaches. We'll go a little bit deeper on that. So Fumi, could you hit the first slide? Okay, so let's take a step back here. I mean, one of the things we do in Project Play is just track data on an annual basis in a range of different areas. One of the primary areas is just simply how many kids are playing sports in this country, because you can't change lives unless they're actually in the game. If they're stuck on the couch at home, they don't have a regular experience, regular access to a coach. There's only so much you can do with this incredibly important institution. So what you see here is data from the Sports and Fitness Industry Association, which we work with, and they track it on an annual basis, how many kids are playing sports and in which forms, right? And so what you can see here is that about 70% of kids play sports in, even just like one time during the year, any of the 120 or so sports that are tracked by SFIA. So about 3 out of 10 kids have no exposure whatsoever to sport. And this isn't just organized sports, this data you see here. It is sports in all forms, pickup sports, neighborhood play, plus organized play, recreational plus travel, touching the game in any form whatsoever. So it's about 73% play sports in any form. We have seen a little bit of a positive story in the past year or so around the number of kids who have played team sport at least one day during the year, right? Kicked a soccer ball, or they may have played, on a regular basis. But about 60% of kids now do, and that's about a 4% uptick from last year. And then we think that is a reflection of a lot of the organizations in the space, many of which are at the Project Play Roundtable that we work with on a regular basis, really focusing on how to address some of these declines in sports and just allowing kids to touch the games in casual ways, whether it be Major League Baseball with their Fun at Bat program, or the NBA is doing a lot of interesting things. Laureus, a lot of folks out there are doing really good work to simply get kids touching the game in some form or another. There's been this decline in individual sports over time. Last year, we finally saw another uptick, which is great. And then team sports, the bottom line is team sports on a regular basis. And again, a slight uptick as well. Now, this is data from 2019. It was captured just prior to COVID hitting, okay? So we expect these numbers to go down this year, and potentially significantly down. Our separate data, the research we have done with Utah State, shows that kids are far less active than they were pre-COVID. And about 3 out of 10 kids now, according to their parents, have decided they're no longer interested in the sport, their primary sport they were playing. So that's a signal to us that the quality of the experience could be improved. Kids have had this, they've stepped away and they said, you know what, I'm cool without it. And that doesn't happen unless they're, that doesn't happen if they've got access to a quality experience and a quality coach. So we've got a real challenge ahead of us here in terms of restoring and improving participation rates. Next slide, please. Okay, and what you can see here too is we break this down by demographic, right? So, and this goes back to 2012. So with you can see this drop off since 2012. That's been pretty significant. Again, an uptick in many cases in the past year, but boys are still participating at higher rates than girls. Kids from lower income homes play much less than kids from upper income homes. There are breakdowns by gaps by race as well. Kids who are white play at much greater rates than kids who are black and brown. So these are things we need to be mindful of as we begin to design solutions. Next slide, please. So this is actually a really good story. Okay, so again, data from 2018 to 2019. What we saw was a significant uptick in the percentage of coaches who were trained in pretty much all the key competencies in working with kids, including effective motivational techniques, which is sort of our imperfect way of understanding how much coach training is being done in the area of social and emotional learning. So again, the significant jump there: sports skills and tactics, physical conditioning, general safety and injury prevention, concussion management, and CPR and basic first aid. But it's very important to recognize that even though there's an uptick, as Haviland said earlier, that's still only about a third of the coaches who are trained in key competencies in the past 12 months. So there's huge room for improvement here, and there's really speaks to the need for this project. When we look at this data and when we talk to our experts, we see several good things happening. There's been a real focus, certainly within Project Play and the Project Play 2020 and now 2024 roundtable around improving the quality of coaching. Really try to ask organizations, again, what are you doing to help get coaches trained? So there have been a lot of efforts that have been put in place over the past few years. I would say the Million Coach Challenge is arguably, one of, if not the most significant opportunities moving forward. But there is, it's not running against a culture anymore where people don't want coaches trained. We do think there is more of an appreciation for the value of coaches being trained, and there's also, frankly, a need. I mean, safe sport requirements to protect your organization, from liability matters. It's just been emphasized. Technology is making it easier to push out coach training opportunities. So it's going in the right direction, and this particular initiative really presents the opportunity to really continue to up those numbers. So let me bring in Chris here. So Chris Moore, CEO of the Positive Coaching Alliance. Chris, when you look at these numbers on that last slide I just showed, what runs through your mind? I think you're on mute, Chris.
I kept telling myself not to do that. First of all, I want to just thank Haviland and Kevin on behalf of Positive Coaching Alliance. We're thrilled to be part of this initiative, the Million Coaches Challenge, and to be an anchor partner with Susan Crown. And Tom, thank you so much, as always. Always love being on a panel with you. So those numbers, quite honestly, give me a little pause. I'm a little concerned. While there have been certainly some increases in participation across various sports and demographics themselves, as you noted, a lot of this data was collected pre-pandemic. And if what we saw after the Great Recession, immediately after 2008, 2009, where there was a huge drop-off in participation, particularly among youth in disadvantaged or underserved communities, I'm afraid that with the number of people who are unemployed in this country and who have kids who are not of means, that we're going to see that gulf widening, that gap widening between the haves and the have-nots, which, as you know, has been a prevailing problem within youth sports. But it also speaks to, the importance of a well-trained coach who can help, provide healing at a time when our nation's youth need it most. So at Positive Coaching Alliance, we've been doing social emotional learning, as it relates to our coach training for the last 22 years. And we're really fortunate to be part of this initiative and to be named an anchor partner with Susan Crown Exchange. Before I joined PCA, as you know, I was the CEO of US Youth Soccer, and there I witnessed firsthand the need for this type of positive youth development training. And that's what really excited me about joining PCA. But what I observed in 5 years within soccer, and even prior to that in youth football, is that we talk a lot about the importance of well-trained coaches, right? Many of our coaches get their start as volunteers coaching their own kids. League administrators look around and they ask who wants to volunteer to coach. And so, when no one raises their hand, one dad or mom raises his or her hand and they accept the whistle, they accept the clipboard, and off they go, but they don't have the training necessary. And what I've also found is that most coaches, in specific sports, Olympic sports, they focus on the basic competence of being a coach, or they focus on, for example, transferring their knowledge of the game, and the skill to athletes. And that's important, to focus on the technical, the tactical, the performance skills. Those are important. But what's equally, if not more important, especially now, is that there needs to be a greater emphasis on skills other than just the technical and the competence, such as building confidence, self-esteem, and positive self-worth. There's a connection and camaraderie that has to exist on the team as well, not just between the players, but between the player and his or her coach. We know that, for example, outcomes of character truly matter, including honoring the game, being respectful of officials, self-control, and just the overall climate or environment that surrounds the team. That's also important. And coaches are the ones who really create this and foster this. So, like motivation and, team harmony and team cohesion, building mutual trust among and between players and coaches. And then we at Positive Coaching Alliance, we, critical to our training and our success in training coaches is the teaching of life lessons, right? So goal setting, growth. We often talk to student athletes and coaches about communication skills and the interpersonal skills that are essential, leadership, resilience. And so I think those numbers you just showed, Tom, really demonstrate that there are some systemic issues in youth sports, but all roads lead back to coaching. And also, I would say the single most important difference maker in terms of outcomes for athletes and research, our own research and external evaluation bears this out, is that athletes who are, or who are part of environments where there's positive coaching, that makes a huge difference, because it's positive coaching that gives youth athletes a sense of enjoyment, fun, satisfaction, and in this environment, that's really important.
Yeah, so we within Project Play have tried to talk to our range of stakeholders, our networks about this, about really two things. How do you navigate the moment that's right in front of your face, this incredible challenge of how do you get your programs paid for? How do you work with your kids? What do you do with masks? There's an enormous number of challenges at the moment. However, we also know that out of every crisis is the chance to create a new model, a new opportunity for sport. So Chris, how do you look at this moment as a way to change the value proposition for what coaches are, right? You just talked a little bit about, this idea of my job is to win the game on Saturday, but how can we take this moment and shift it to actually, you know what? My role is to help transform the life of a child and help them develop, social and emotional life skills. Do you think there's more receptivity to that during this moment, and then one that we can build on and build a better state of play coming out of this?
I do. Obviously the industry is in somewhat of a crisis mode because our work is in peril right now, and we are tasked with the enormous responsibility of keeping kids safe in our environments, supporting them, being sensitive to their needs at this time. And so in many of my conversations with other youth sports leaders, I think they are very mindful of this responsibility that we have. When you think of this, think of trauma-informed coaching right now, for example, and you noted kids are wearing masks, and many of the administrators, directors of coaching, technical directors, club leaders, they want to see keep players safe, which is why many are wearing masks. The virtual learning environment has caused a tremendous amount of stress. The fits and starts with school starting and then going back online, graduations last spring and summer being, canceled or done virtually, has created an enormous amount of stress. And so I think the industry is looking at this as an opportunity to sort of rethink the current model. And I know the emphasis has been a lot on what we can each do as leaders, particularly those who directly impact positive youth development through our interactions with players. And so that's why it's important. Social and emotional learning is really important right now, and whether life skills are developed through sports, greatly depends on how coaches intentionally create suitable environments that promote, development of youth. 94% of coaches who complete PCA programming report being prepared for, to use their sport to teach life lessons. And 95% of our trained coaches believe PCA training gives them the tools that they need to give their players to support one another and to support their team. And so I think that this all starts with having coaches be the real difference makers, since they have so much influence over their team and over their players. And right now, more than ever, we need coaches who have the ability to offer social emotional, to cater to the social and emotional needs of their athletes.
Right. And how do you assess the receptivity of volunteers in being coaches? Right. I hear this all the time. Like, well, we're just lucky to get volunteers. Now we're going to ask them to be trained too. And there's this hesitation. But you talk to the folks at USA Hockey who really revamped their whole model 10 years ago and began to ask more of coaches. And they're like, no, once we created better materials and made it easier and mandated it, basically, we didn't have any problem. We didn't see a loss of coaches, and it improved the experience. And we know that from our research that kids cycle out of sports. They only play 2.9 years and they're done by age 11. I mean, coaches are critical agents in moving that, both of those numbers up. They're critical agents in keeping. So what's your sense right now as to how willing people are to want the type of training that we're talking about?
Yeah, it's those are good questions. And you mentioned the dreaded M word, mandate. Most people don't take too kindly to mandating anything, much less wearing a mask. But I think in the case of, given the environment that we're in and the enormous responsibility we have as leaders, and in speaking with some of my colleagues in other sports as well, I think now is the time to mandate training. Parents spend a lot of time researching contractors for a new roof on their house. They spend more time on important things like that than researching whether his or her child has a well-trained and nurturing coach. And I think we'll need to sort of educate parents and leaders within communities across the country on the importance, especially now, of having a well-trained coach. So I think there will be greater receptivity as national sports governing bodies look to recover from this pandemic. Whenever there's a vaccine and kids are back out there on fields or on the court or what have you, I think there'll be a greater willingness to take a look at training volunteer coaches. I mean, paid coaches is less of an issue, but it's the base of the pyramid, which is the grassroots and all of the recreational programs and community programs, who I think suffer most from social and emotional trained coaches. And I think there will be a greater willingness to mandate some of those trainings.
Yep. No, there's one great thing about the Million Coach Challenge. It begins to create incentives, which is
exactly
not mandates, but it's incentives. So again,
right.
Appreciate it. All right. So back to you, Haviland.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom and Chris. Your experience and perspective on the field certainly highlights an increasing need for coach training, and we thank you for taking the time to join us today. Next, I want to introduce Kevin Connors, who's my partner at SCE and the Senior Director here at Susan Crown Exchange, who will share more on the challenge, logistics, and how to participate.
Thank you, Haviland, and thank you to Tom and Chris so much for your partnership and also just for the conversation. It definitely made me think back to my days coaching. And I remember being a new coach, a young coach. I worked in the public schools in St. Louis as a high school teacher and had the privilege of being our varsity baseball coach. And I remember how it felt leading up to that first practice of my first year, and how nervous I was and how, in many ways, overwhelmed I was because of the work ahead. I didn't know where to begin. And I remember calling one of my old coaches and asking for advice. And he said to me, "Kevin, remember, you don't coach baseball, you coach kids." And it was that advice that kind of cut through all the noise, that simplified my role, how I was going to define success, and my priorities moving forward. Of course, we needed to win games. I was the head varsity baseball coach, but I knew that wasn't going to be possible unless we kind of established a culture that was based on positive relationships and a positive culture rooted in personal growth and success. So I just appreciate that conversation, and it's also why I'm personally just excited to be a part of Susan Crown Exchange and this initiative around the Million Coaches Challenge, and excited to share a little more details now about the effort and the application process. So as Haviland mentioned earlier, the Million Coaches Challenge is a funding opportunity with the goal to get 1 million coaches trained in youth development practices by 2025. Tom shared some data earlier around motivational techniques being the best proxy we have for social and emotional learning or youth development at this time. And that's kind of the number we're working off of. We know that less than a third of coaches reported being trained in the last year. And we think that there is a missed opportunity, especially in the current moment of the pandemic. So we're hoping that the incentives, the funding opportunity is one barrier that we can begin to solve for through this initiative. In order to apply, there are a few requirements or criteria that need to be responded to in the application itself. The first is this focus on increasing the number of coaches who have been trained. While some initiatives or proposals may come in and might be working on developing resources or curriculum, and we welcome that, at the end of the day, the goal is to reach an additional 1 million coaches over the next 4 years. And we see that taking place through a number of ways. So there's not one kind of cookie cutter approach we're expecting to see. We know that it's a very localized environment and different stakeholders have different positions to train or impact this space. And so we think this may take place in a few rounds. We expect proposals that may be focused on scaling existing initiatives or trainings that are focused on youth development. We anticipate some that are designed to launch new training programs focused in this content area, or ones that are enhancing current trainings with new content. Perhaps there's trainings right now around health and safety or specific sports skills, but we're adding some additional content around youth development, social emotional learning, and others. The second sub-bullet here that I think is important to call out is that we are very open around the mechanism or strategy you might employ to reach more coaches. Some organizations may be looking to build up their own internal capacity. You may be looking to make internal investments to carry out trainings yourselves, whereas others may be more in a position to bring on external training partners, such as Positive Coaching Alliance, who's an early partner in this work, or it might be a combination of the two. And we're open and excited to see the creativity and based on your unique context, the strategy you believe will be most effective in reaching coaches with this training. We are open to coaches who are working both in and out of school, as long as it's an organized sport context, both competitive and kind of recreational or non-competitive environments, as well as team or individual-based sports. The last note regarding this requirement is the threshold for the number of coaches who need to be met over the course of a proposal. The grant period for the Million Coaches Challenge is up to 3 years. So we're offering funding for $200,000 per year up to 3 years. And during that time, we have a baseline of 5,000 coaches who must be met with a particular initiative. First, we recognize that some organizations who have large national or regional footprints might be able to meet that requirement because there's that number of coaches within their immediate circles. But we recognize that a lot of really strong organizations won't meet that requirement because we're working more on a local level or on a regional level. If that is you and you're still interested in being a part of the Million Coaches Challenge, we do have a couple of recommended pathways. One is to apply in partnership with other organizations. So for instance, whether they are in your sport or out of your sport, if a group of 3 or 4 or 5 organizations would like to kind of team up and submit a joint application where collectively they're meeting that 5,000 coach minimum, that's something we would be excited to consider. The other option is for organizations who may be more local, but they're part of a broader network. For instance, a school. They're part of a school district. And the recommendation would be to explore whether an application can be submitted through that regional or network body on behalf of all the local providers. So a school district might apply on behalf of all the schools, and that will increase the number of coaches who might be reached through a partnership. And if neither of those scenarios apply to your circumstances and you're still interested in training, I would just encourage you to think about organizations like PCA or the resources that Aspen have begun to put out to get started with some training efforts in a cost-effective way. Next slide, please. The next 3 and the last 3 requirements for the application at this stage relate mostly to content and how we'll be tracking progress. So first is to employ high quality training practices. We're not requiring a specific type of training. We're open to, when we return, to in-person, hybrid, virtual trainings. The goal here is that whatever mechanism or mode we're using to train coaches is that it subscribes to high quality professional development practices. If you go online and you read more details in our FAQ about the challenge, you'll see there are a couple frameworks for high quality professional learning that we'll be referencing. When applications are submitted to us, we'll look at the training, at kind of like the form and dosage of your training and say, does it align to these principles? In particular, we reference the Learning Policy Institute's 7 elements for professional development, and we'll apply that to determine whether it meets a standard of quality. The second is around content, and it's that SEL, social emotional learning, or youth development principles must be a focus or foundation of training. I mentioned earlier that trainings may incorporate other really critical competencies like health and safety or sport specific skill building, and we welcome that. But a critical component is that SEL and youth development principles are at the forefront of the training experience for coaches. Again, we're not mandating a particular curriculum or set of resources or even a framework, but we are asking applicants to align the content of their training to reputable frameworks. Again, in the FAQs and the application, you'll see we reference a few as examples, such as the Castle Core Competencies, or Aspen's Calls for Coaches, or the Weichert Center's Preparing Youth to Thrive guide. And those are SEL frameworks that you might be able to align your content towards, but there are others. And so we welcome other forms of content that align to different practices and frameworks, so long as you can articulate the quality behind that. And the last requirement for the application is that we are asking candidates to articulate how you're currently or how you will measure reach and impact. So how will we measure the number of coaches we're reaching, and how will we measure the progress we're making, the impact we're having on both our coaches and our athletes at the end of the day. It's an imperfect science, it's a tall order, but it is something that we're hoping to bring into the fold as we embark on a national effort to train 1 million coaches. And we're also really intrigued by the idea of having a cohort of organizations who might also brainstorm and collaborate around measurement strategies, knowing that that can be a complex problem to solve in this space. Now, beyond these requirements, there are a few additional priority areas for the application. Applicants don't need to speak to these, but we do hold a special regard for those that do speak to one or more of these areas. And the first is initiatives that build equity, that have an equity lens on it, given the conversation Tom and Chris had, given the current state of affairs in the country, and given the fact that historically marginalized communities like those of color, girls, children with disabilities, who have not had access to high quality sports experiences and in turn high quality coaching, I'd like to bring initiatives to the forefront that are addressing some of those gaps and some of those needs. The second is initiatives that foster innovative partnerships. So one thing we have learned by diving deep into the sports landscape is that it's incredibly localized, is that every community has different contexts, different stakeholders who kind of organize or manage the youth sports landscape. And we recognize that in some cases, partnerships might be needed. It may be an intermediary or a governing body in one place, it may be a school district in another, it may be a combination of those folks in a third. And we're interested in learning about partnerships that may strengthen your proposal to reach more coaches or to run deeper with those communities. And the last is to raise awareness and stimulate demand. Yes, this is about offering training, but we know that in order for coaches to sign up or for coaches to want to sign up, that there will need to be some work around buy-in and around incentivizing coaches to do so. And so we'll be interested to learn about your ideas for your communities and the coaches you serve and how you'll be able to do that. The final steps are more logistical, and it's about next steps for applying. And so for anyone who is interested in applying, we encourage you to visit Susan Crown Exchange's website, and there you can access the full complete language of the challenge. We'd encourage you to read that in detail. You can understand our framing, our context, and you'll also see the frequently asked questions. There's a list of common questions there that we try to shed light on, especially in case we don't get to all the questions that we hear today. Then through the website, you can submit an LOI, a letter of inquiry. That's really the first step in submitting an application. Letter of inquiries are a summary of your initiative, and they are an opportunity to give background on your organization, your project, the type of training you offer, and just a high-level budget for what you'd be anticipating over the course of your time period. We would ask the letters of inquiry to be submitted through our online grants management system, which is called Foundant, and there's a link to that on our website. And we'll be considering LOIs up until the end of January 29th. It's an open application period until then. And following that date, we will review the LOIs in detail and reach out to a group of semifinalists to submit full applications. We are really honored that there's this level of interest in the initiative. We're excited to see the breadth of applications that come in and the breadth of opportunities, and appreciate the time you all have taken to learn more about the initiative. I believe now we have some time for questions, and I know a few have come in through the chat. So I'll welcome Jennifer and a few others back to the screen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. And I'm gonna bring a few people back in to join us for Q&A. Nothing like multitasking. So I just want to welcome Jason Sachs, who serves as the Executive Vice President for many, many things at Positive Coaching Alliance. Sorry, I don't have her title right in front of me right now.
Good.
But I just want to remind our audience that that you can ask questions via the question and answer section in Zoom. And there's been a lot of great questions that have come in, but also still encourage you to learn more specifics through the FAQ that is posted on the Susan Crown website. So I'm actually going to start with the bottom question that came in, because I think it's a really great place to start this conversation. But one of the audience members asked, what are the top skills that coaches should be learning if they have not received any training? Should it be sport focused or something else? So Tom, I'm actually going to make you take that question first, then go to Jason and Kevin.
Well, the first thing I would say is it's not an either or, but like if you had to pick one, I think it speaks to what Kevin recognized earlier in his talk, is that you're coaching kids before you're coaching athletes. So how do you, what is a general philosophy, communication skills, and ability to empathize and understand who the kids you are who you're working with as human beings. So, I mean, I would argue that the first thing you ought to learn is about social and emotional learning and understanding what's age appropriate and how to work with kids.
Jason?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, PCA has been built on the model of, yes, we want to win and that, we want to compete to win, that's important. But the most important goal of sports, and Kevin's talked about it, Tom and Chris have talked about it, is if kids aren't having fun and having a good experience, then we're going to lose them. And so what are the skills that we can teach coaches about how are we creating this positive environment for the kids to feel cared for and to feel like they can improve? And so that means coaches need to focus on things like process and things that kids can control versus only focusing on the result. So while there are a lot of important things coaches need to learn, I think if you're only going to focus on one thing, it is how do you make that experience fun for the child and make sure that you're creating a culture and an environment that is safe and caring for them.
And the only thing I would add to that is, I think about my experience as a classroom teacher, and it was very similar. You had to start by building relationships and building trust before you could get to academics. And I think the same is true for the field, no matter what sport or what age you're coaching.
Great. And I know part of the conversation that Tom and Chris had was really about the diversity of coaches in the field, that there are parent volunteer coaches, through school-based coaches to professional paid coaches. And there was some conversation a little bit about the different types of training that's required. But I think, Kevin, if you don't mind taking this question first, just to say, given the spectrum of coaches that are out there, this is the Million Coaches Challenge targeted at a specific type of coach? And then, Tom and Jason, can you talk a little bit about your organization's work with that diversity of coaches and what works in terms of required or mandated training versus optional training?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the short answer is no. There's not a specific target population. From what we've learned, whether through our more traditional social emotional learning work of the last 7 years or the deep dive into the youth sports space in the last 2, is that social emotional needs and well-being is a conversation and priority in every context, in every community. They just present differently. And so from our perspective, we hope to fund a cohort of organizations and do hope there's diversity within that. Organizations who are operating in highly competitive environments, others who are operating in more recreational, team-based, individual-based, and we welcome applications from all of those. And for that reason, we think there's some mutual learning that can take place as well. And so we're open to meeting kind of the needs where they're at, and especially as long as those training experiences are tailored to that community. I think that's a really important piece of it, understanding what the context is, who you're coaching, who you're working towards, and we'll be eager to read about those approaches. Jason or Tom?
Yeah, the one thing I would add there is PCA has always taken the approach of a lot of the nuts and bolts and foundation of our training is going to be consistent, but how we're packaging it or the examples that we're using around it will differ depending on who is in the audience and who we're working with. And one example of that is, we work a lot with high schools, and then we also work with youth sports organizations. So in our online training, our self-paced online courses, we have one that are really tailored more towards that high school coach or that travel team coach that is meeting with their team multiple times a week, maybe multiple games, and you're building a much closer bond where you're focusing on the culture of the team, and it is probably a little more competitive versus that maybe 5-year-old all the way up through that it's just recreation, it's getting kids involved, it's keeping them involved, it's keeping them have fun. But with that said, all of those things we want to make sure we're doing at the high school level as well and making sure that's a good experience. So I think there's a lot of, what PCA tries to really go back to is there are some key principles, and then there are a lot of different examples and specific tools that you can use depending if you're coaching youth or if you're coaching high school.
Yeah, I'll just give you a little bit of, I'll give you a little data to that maybe help sharpen the conversation a little bit here, which is that we know there are the demographics of coaching. We know that about 75, 78% of coaches out there are men. We also know that certainly with volunteer coaches, ages of kids and teens ages 14 or under, it skews heavily toward high income. Okay, so these are volunteer coaches coming out of homes of $100,000 or more. There is a real need to develop more coaches for kids in lower income communities. We just got to find a way. And there's a quantity problem too. We know that a few years ago, there were about 6.5 million coaches who were coaching kids ages, again, 14 or under. This is not high school, 14 or under. Well, that's down to 5.8 million now. And that was pre-COVID, right? And now you've got additional restrictions. So we have a real challenge on our hands in making sure that kids in the communities and in the homes that need good coaching the most have access to those people. So there's a quantity conversation and there's a quality conversation that needs to occur. And that's what I love about the Million Coach Challenge. I mean, it speaks to the numeric, it speaks to the quantity, and as well as the quality piece as well.
Yeah, so there've been a lot of questions about some specifics related to the Million Coach Challenge, and I want folks in the audience to know that we will get to those, and if they are not answered here, we will definitely follow up with you to get those questions answered. But I want to ask one more big picture question before we get into some of the specifics, because I think that this is a pretty COVID on point question right now, which is in the past, coach training has typically happened in person. It's been, creation of a learning community in some ways. for coaches to interact with each other. Because of COVID, in a lot of ways, we've moved to an online environment, and many organizations, Aspen, PCA, have put out online tools that folks can use. What do you think is the value of these virtual environments? And do you think that coach training might even move into a coach training app over time? Tom, I'm going to have you take that first, Jason, and then Kevin, close out with you.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the real opportunities that's born from this crisis, which is that you have to do things online. We've all figured out how to do Zoom meetings, right? And we got used to our teams working this way. So, I mean, absolutely, online is going to be a major piece, maybe even a dominant piece. It's certainly more affordable. It's scalable. You can, show that people completed courses. I mean, it's where the future exists, really, especially if we're going to up the numbers of the percentage of coaches who are trained in this country and the number of coaches who are simply coaching at all. I mean, you can't manage what you can't measure, right? I would say, however, that all of us recognize the value of in-person, being there and just demonstrating techniques, having more than a few hours to or more than an hour to spend with people. So I don't want to discount that, but I mean, ideally, it's a hybrid kind of environment moving forward, where the real opportunity to scale up is online. That's my assessment, at least.
Yeah, I mean, PCA was built on, we like to use the phrase, like, we were unfreezing coaches in these live interactive sessions, and we've had to shift to virtual training. And since mid-March, we've completed over 600 interactive Zoom trainings. So what we really wanted to focus on was, not everybody is Zoomed out, right? But we want to make sure that we created an opportunity where people feel like they were still getting that engagement and virtual experience. And the feedback we've received is that people have enjoyed those workshops just as much as the in-person, because of the way we've utilized breakout rooms and multiple presenters and polling and some of the things we've used today. And so we see this as an opportunity that Zoom training is going to be a part of our product line moving forward, because it gives us that opportunity to reach a lot more people, right? And we've heard from athletic directors and directors of coaches saying, this was much easier to get all my coaches together versus making sure they were all in this classroom at this time on this date. It was much easier to be able to do that via Zoom. So that's one thing. The second thing is PCA has always had a self-paced online coach courses and also courses for parents and athletes and officials. We've just completely upgraded them. They were launched, the new versions were launched last month, that are mobile friendly, that are up to speed with and up to date with current day e-learning preferences. We worked with a e-learning company that really focused on how can we reach more users in underserved communities. And so how can we meet them where they are? How can we make this more conducive to schedules? So if they only need to do 3 minutes at a time to complete that 60-minute course, it's very easy to go in and out and access it. They don't feel like they're dropping off in the middle of a lesson. And we're quizzing right after each video, so that they're really collecting that information and learning it, versus having this one long module or one long course and then being quizzed at the end. So we've found that we need to pivot, we need to shift, we need to meet people where they are. And so one of the silver linings is, I think, that we're going to be able to really reach a lot more coaches because of the virtual and the online setting. And when we can get back to in-person, great, because there's nothing that can replace that opportunity.
I agree with Tom and Jason. I think you guys did a great job laying out the opportunities of virtual, both in terms of reach and the ability to personalize. And it is a little bit about breadth versus depth in that conversation. Just to tie it back to the Million Coach application, we certainly welcome, especially in this environment, those applications that focus on virtual trainings. And I would say the principles that apply to in-person regarding quality and those standards and professional learning frameworks that I mentioned earlier will still be applied to the virtual environment. And I think that's something we've all learned. There's high quality virtual training, and then there is more middle of the road trainings. And so we'll still be looking at applications that are highly engaging, that are still seeking feedback, that are personalizing, that are creating connections and interactions among members. And that's all possible in the virtual environment. We would just ask folks to really like lay that process out so that there's that degree of confidence in the quality of the virtual approach.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And just a few kind of tick the box questions that have come in, maybe that you can take to close before we close out. First, can you give a sense of how detailed folks' budgets need to be? And then also, can you provide a little bit more information about the overall timeline for the grant from the LOI till the next phases?
Yeah, absolutely. So at this stage, at the LOI stage, the budgets can be very high level. A simple table of by year, what are your costs, what are your funding, what are your revenue sources, just to get a sense of the scale of what you're responding to. We don't need line items like how much is going towards IT, how much is going towards facilitators, how much is going towards staff or materials. We'll ask for that at a later stage if you're invited to the full proposal. In terms of the overall timeline, again, the deadline to submit a letter of inquiry is January 29th. We will not be reviewing any before that date. So this is to give time for organizations to put together multi-year plans, to develop partnerships if that's something of interest, but then to make sure that's submitted by the 29th. We'll then spend most of February reviewing those letters of inquiry, and we'll reach out likely by the end of February or early March to a subset of organizations to invite them to the full proposal round. Applications will be likely due in April, and then we'll be making final decisions in approximately mid to late May.
Great, thanks. And then one final question before we invite Haviland to close this out. Can the trainings be beyond folks that are actual coaches, but supporting a sports-based environment? So think more of sports-based youth development organizations that might have a combination of folks that play coaching roles versus maybe some more academic support roles or case manager type roles. Would those count in the number of coaches, so to speak?
We wouldn't count them in the number of coaches towards progress towards this goal, but we do welcome a robust application. If that's something that you're tying into this initiative because they complement each other so well, you can submit that and we'll consider that. It's possible that we may choose to only fund the portion that's supporting coaches directly, but off the bat, it doesn't make those folks ineligible from being supported through the initiative. Though again, we will only count the coaches towards the goal of reaching 1 million.
Fabulous. Well, I want to turn it over to Haviland to close this out.
Sure. So I just want to thank all of our panelists and our participants, of course, for joining us today. We hope you share our interest in this challenge and look forward to learning more about your organization's approach to coach training. I know that Will has shared out a few different resources throughout the chat, so we encourage you to kind of go through and look at those. We will respond to questions that didn't get answered during this webinar, but also if you go to millioncoaches.org, you can submit any additional questions through that site. We monitor that regularly and we'll respond to your questions. And you'll also find an FAQ document on that site that we also update regularly after we receive questions from folks in the field. So thank you all for joining us. We hope you have a good afternoon.